darkmyths.org and Neopolis Media Group proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. I am your host, Rob Clark. This is episode number 167. I almost fucked Lee Harvey Oswald. I know that might be a bit of a brash title for this episode, but sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And no, this episode is not about Judith Vary Baker. In fact, it quite contradicts Judith Vary Baker's alleged acumen of Lee Harvey Oswald's sexuality and what he preferred. Now, we've been taking a deep dive into New Orleans stuff and the Weisberg archives, to be more specific, these past few shows, and today's going to be no different. I figured, well, I was scouring the Weisberg archives and I came across this very strange and odd letter to Harold Weisberg in February of 1992. The preface states, "Mr. Weisberg, thank you for the books. Enclosed is the article on Oswald I told you about. I hope it is of some use to you. In the course of my own investigation, I have run across information you might also find useful. I'm typing it up presently and will enclose a copy with my next book order." He says, "This information comes from two sources whom I believe to be very accurate due to the nature of the work. Thanks again, Carl." This comes from Carlos Ball from 7th Avenue, New York. New York. And it even encloses a letter. Now, apparently, this Carlos Ball worked for United Feature Syndicate, an affiliate of United Media, a Scripps Howard company. So apparently this guy had some connections in the industry. And this is, of course, all around the time that Oliver Stone's movie had just come out. And of course, Weisberg was not a fan of Oliver Stone and his movie entitled JFK that was about Garrison. And the title of this story I'm about to read you, folks, is called JFK Movie and Myth. And it tackles some intriguing propositions and some events that were going on in New Orleans at the time, as it revolves around Oswald and Garrison in particular. Now, most of you who have studied this case understand that a lot of the folks that we refer to as players in New Orleans specifically were homosexual. And of course, we know Clay Shaw, David Ferry had the tendencies. many folks that you wouldn't think of. Carlos Bernier, Carlos Quiroga, as a matter of fact. I think they might have been doing the dance, if you know what I mean. Many of the places that they were hanging out, such as the Court of the Two Sisters, this Eugene Davis fellow, whom Dean Andrews identified as being the person that called him as Clay Bertrand, even though there was a real Clay Bertrand who was a bouncer at the show bar. Also, there was a big, I don't know if you would call it a gay underground or what the hell was going on. I have no idea. But New Orleans at the time was very welcoming to these eccentric type folks, a little more tolerant. It was like the South's version of San Francisco. But just bear in mind that, even when Dean Andrews said Oswald came into his office, he was with two swishy little fellows, two swishy little Latin fellows. And Dean Andrews often represented these young gay men at the behest of people that paid for him that wanted things to be kept on the down low, I guess you would call it. And of course, Dean Andrews didn't care about anything but the almighty dollar. So, and who's to say he wasn't doing anything? Who knows? But to get into it, let's just get right into it, because this is something that I'd never heard before. And it's very interesting and intriguing to think about. So, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, this letter starts off, "It was August of '63 when I met Lee Harvey Oswald for the first time. Now, almost 29 years later, I am still seeing him in old TV and newsreel photos in Oliver Stone's controversial film JFK. Still haunted by the same rodent features, contorted by the pain of his fatal wound at the hands of that complete enigma, Jack Ruby. It didn't take much rearranging for Oliver Stone to recreate New Orleans 25 or 30 years ago for his film JFK, because New Orleans really hasn't changed that much. Lafayette Square, where much of the exterior shots are filmed, from most angles looks exactly the way it did then. Although, there are a lot of areas in New Orleans where nothing can be changed short of an act of Congress, or more specifically the City Council. Buildings and other landmarks tend to stay as they are. So when I went to see JFK, I did not feel jarred or dragged back into the past the way I was when I saw Bugsy a few days before. It did, however, carry me back to the day where I met Lee Harvey Oswald in August of '63. An incident I am sure would have been forgotten by me years ago had he not gained infamy and notoriety briefly several months later." Here we go, folks. Get ready for this. The summer of '63 was unremarkable in most ways. It was hot and humid, as New Orleans generally is during the summer, but it was a year of a mosquito plague, which came about all too often in the days before the city started spraying the surrounding swamps in 1965. Prior to that, any rainy spring yielded a bumper crop of mosquitoes by June. In the 19th century, summers decimated the population, since the mosquitoes carried yellow fever, malaria, and cholera, which were just memories among the aged and infirmed by the summer of '63, at which time they were just a nasty fact of life to be borne by staying indoors or inside screened porches. Swimming pool, barbecue, and beach parties came to an abrupt and very early end in those years. By August of '63, I was working a clerical job in the business district, and I had already had my 2-week vacation in July, spent at a family summer home on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, where my cousins, some friends, and I had spent our entire vacation period racing from the house to someone's parents' air-conditioned cars, since we were all just out of college or still in school, and our cars did not come with such luxuries as air conditioning. We went sailing or bar hopping to Biloxi, which we called whoring around, and although there were probably 10,000 prostitutes between Gulfport and Biloxi, we never seemed to find any that were below 40. Since I was still deep in the closet, I just drank a lot. We argued a lot about politics, and we were evenly divided between those that thought President Kennedy was a great man and those who thought he was a nigger-loving commie. Towards the end of that summer, something had to go to the post office to meet a deadline. And since the girl who generally made these late afternoon runs was on vacation, I volunteered just to get out of the office. That required me walking through Lafayette Square, upon which the post office faced. It got me out of the office at the end of a long, dull day, and I was always curious about the guys who hung out there. Most of them were old, bummy types, since this was on the edge of Skid Row bars and flophouses, but there were always one or two guys my own age just kind of hanging out, watching the people go by and drinking beer out of paper sacks. On this particular day, one guy was standing by the walk with his foot on a bench. He looked me over carefully and said hi. I said hi in return, and taking his foot off the bench, he started walking along with me. He told me I had a nice suit on and asked me where I had gotten it. It was a tan poplin suit that was of a type sold by most of the better stores in the area. I thanked him for the compliment and told him the store name. He told me that he hadn't had a suit since he was in high school, and that he needed one to advance his career. I wondered what kind of career he had in mind, but I never got around to asking. He wasn't attractive at all. In fact, he was what we would call a nerdy type. But he was pleasant and complimentary. His next sentence startled me. "You're really good looking. I bet you get a lot of girlfriends after you." I muttered something like, "Not really," and changed direction so as not to be headed back to my office. He wasn't dirty or grubby, but rather clean. He had on washed khakis and a sports shirt of the cheap kind that had the flat-laying collar. His military-type lace-up shoes were shined, but still, this was not the way my friends from work or school dressed, and I was getting very nervous. I wasn't sure what he wanted of me, but that line had been used on me before, when I wandered the French Quarter alone during lunch hour. It was generally a prelude to an invitation to an apartment, which ended up in hot sex. But I did not do that often, unless I were in front of Galatoires or Antoines, I could be reasonably sure that I wouldn't run into someone that I knew during the day in the French Quarter. Businessmen were not as adventurous as they are today, seeking out obscure little restaurants that are cheap and good. But Lafayette Square was right out in the center of the business district, and I was afraid I would run into someone that I knew. It was hot and humid, and being uptight, I started to sweat profusely. He suggested that I take off my coat, and asked me if I wanted to cool off at his room. "It's only about a block away," he said. I stumbled around trying to think of something to say. The idea of a room as opposed to an apartment did not sound particularly appealing to me. And although by that time I had gone with medical students, bank clerks, antique dealers, all of whom had more or less pretentious and fussy apartments, the raunchiness, the flophouse backdrop somehow appealed to me. Oh yes, I had been to a borderline flophouse with a Marine on leave, and his blowjob in a clean but plain room with chenille bedspread had me climbing the wall and rattling the iron bedstead. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm trying to read this. Okay, here we go. He was interesting but not fascinating. His English was passable. a far cry above the cracker jargon one heard among the people who loitered in Lafayette Square. Then he killed the whole deal. He said, "Can you lend me $10? I'm a little behind on my rent, and it'll make my landlord happy." I told him I didn't have $10 on me. In the French Quarter in '63, with beer costing as little as 35 cents for draft, 50 cents and 75 cents a bottle, and parking $1, my friends and I could spend an entire evening going from bar to bar, getting reasonably slopped up, and still have a buck or so left over. And I was certainly not going to spend $10 for an afternoon in a flop house. I had heard that there were such people who sold their bodies, but I had never encountered one before. I told him that I had to get back to my office, and he lowered his price. He said that $5 would probably make the landlord just as happy, wink wink, but it was too late. I did an about face. I told him that it had been nice talking to him and took a circuitous route back to my office. The whole experience left me vaguely unsettled, since I had never been asked to come up with money before, and I was worried that someone I know may have seen me. A few days later, my sister, who was in graduate school at Tulane, asked me if I had seen a man on the TV news who had been arrested by the police in a fracas concerning the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. I was not then, and am still not, a fan of TV news, with photogenic yuppies spouting cryptic scare phrases designed to have one believing that the whole world is coming to an end in the next few minutes, hoping to rivet one's attention while they run through scores of vaginal yeast, hemorrhoid, and constipation commercials. Some things never change. She proceeded to tell me that she had been to a party for the guy who had been arrested, and furthermore, that what he had to say made a lot of sense. I wasn't interested in Fair Play for Cuba, since I had already been there several times and seen the squalor in which the largely uneducated and ignorant population lived. I did not think that either the exploitative free enterprise system or the repressive communist system could help those unfortunate people. And I still have no idea how one can help the Latin American countries with their sharply unequal divisions of wealth, with the ruling class supported by the equally repressive Roman Catholic Church entrenched in its position for the last 5 centuries. My sister told me I was vapid and unconcerned with mankind, and the following year went to UC Berkeley, where she met and married an American communist who was so opposed to the fascist government in the U.S. that during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he moved to Cuba, where he lived and worked for several years. Although he was a physicist of accomplishment, the Cuban bureaucracy assigned him to work in a facility endeavoring to set up Cuban air conditioning industry. While he was struggling with BTU output ratios, the government complained about his lack of progress. They wanted to see what the completed machines would look like, and they were totally dissatisfied with his utilitarian sketches. The Castro government wanted them to resemble the cathedral-style radios which were in vogue in the U.S. in the 30s. Shortly thereafter, he returned to the U.S., thoroughly disillusioned with Cuba, but not with the Marxist dream. In any case, several months later, on that fateful day in Dallas, in November of 1963, the late evening news carried pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald from childhood up until his arrest in the Fair Play for Cuba incident. Coincidentally, in front of the International Trademark Building, the organization and building put together by local businessman Clay Shaw. Because they ran the photographs chronologically from his childhood, it was a few minutes before I recognized Oswald as the man who had struck up the conversation with me that day in Lafayette Square. I went into a total panic, during which I pictured myself being identified with this heinous assassin and being led off to a federal prison. The feeling was awful, indescribable to one who has not lived the lie of a homosexual hiding in a heterosexual world. I didn't get to sleep until something like 4 in the morning, even though I was stricken with the thought of a conspiracy at the highest level of government, to wit, the wheeler-dealer who stood most to gain by Kennedy's death was our Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, but more about that later. On Sunday morning, I was nursing a hangover from heavy drinking as a result of the anxiety produced by my recognition of one Lee Harvey Oswald as the man who approached me in Lafayette Square 3 months prior, when I saw him gunned down by Jack Ruby. New Orleans winters are quite temperate, and through open windows I could hear neighbors calling to each other about the horror of it all. Although the nation was in a state of shock for months after, I realized I was safe from ever being connected with Oswald now that he was dead. My life went back to its lazy, paranoid, closet case existence. In the ensuing years, I began going to bars where I knew I could meet people of my own kind. As I moved up in my company, I began to meet a wider range of people through business, and among them was the founder and driving force of the international trade mart, one Mr. Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw was a known homosexual, but one never would have known it by looking at him. He was large, 6'5" at least in height, and probably weighed in at about 220 pounds, and physically imposing. He had the manner of a hard-nosed businessman, and other than the attacks on him by Jim Garrison, probably the greatest disservice ever done to him was the portrayal of him by Tommy Lee Jones in JFK. Jones, who does bear a certain facial resemblance to Shaw, plays him as an effeminate dilettante, which Shaw certainly was not. Jones plays him as Dean Stockwell played the sadistic dope dealer in Blue Velvet, and at times one expects him in the courtroom to break out into a smirking lip sync of Roy Orbison's In Dreams. This was not the Clay Shaw that any of us saw in his public life. He was practically the only known homosexual in New Orleans who was socially acceptable. And by that I do not mean that he went to debutante balls and the like. Since he didn't have a wife or children, he probably wasn't interested in them. He did regularly attend the parties of leading business and civic leaders, sometimes escorting prominent unmarried or divorced ladies, but most often alone. It was a known fact that he had an older gentleman of means who was his mentor, as they said in polite circles, and they entertained together at their home or at joint parties in haute monde restaurants. No one ever saw them necking or waltzing together, and in fact, as I got more into the homosexual subculture and started hanging out at the bars regularly, I never saw him in any place except in business places or large, basically straight parties in the French Quarter. It might be wise for a moment to consider the social fabric of New Orleans in the 60s. New Orleans, like the other great ports of entry into the New World, New York and San Francisco, had a homosexual subculture going almost since their founding, but certainly after they became busy ports, with a subculture in which one could mix and meet the old families and the newly rich families, because big families always have a variety of types. Almost all had an uncle or cousin who was a confirmed bachelor, wink wink, the euphemism of choice among the educated. The others were referred to by their families as being funny, but funny strange, not funny ha-ha. At a power lunch in which I was in attendance, the name of Clay Shaw came up, and one uptight homophobe referred to him as that big queer. This gentleman had every reason to be uptight. His family was replete with several homosexual scoundrels, including an unfortunate suicide and the banishment of one of the family members to the West Coast, where it was announced to those who inquired after him that he was in a mental institution. But one of the others at the luncheon, a prominent lawyer, interrupted the uptight one and said in reference to Clay Shaw, "No, what you mean to say is that he is a homosexual gentleman." The topic of conversation was quickly changed, and a strained feeling pervaded the rest of the lunch, which broke up earlier than usual so everyone could rush back to their offices and relate this curious tale to their associates. I mention this by way of contrast to the actual harassment of homosexuals that was the standard order of the police department, whose methods of entrapment were notorious, even hilarious, as recounted in Confederacy of Dunces. The worst incident was the matter of the Quorum Club. Now, the Quorum Club was a coffee house on Esplanade Avenue, the lower boundary of the French Quarter. It is a place where a group of middle-aged bohemians, painters, and poet wannabes, students and school teachers hung out in the early 60s. Hardly radical by the standards of a few years later, the more or less informal gatherings discussed anarchism and syndicalism, cubism and expressionism, nudism and free love, Rilke and Nietzsche. It was not a place where people went to pick up others at a singles bar, but rather a group who either thought of themselves as intellectuals or sought the company of persons more intellectual than themselves. A few were retired school teachers, but the majority were working ordinary jobs in the business community. Of a hardcore group of 30 regulars, perhaps 4 were homosexual. The place had no particular reputation, but one night the New Orleans police raided it and arrested everyone for subversive activities, in quotes, a charge which I believe was never accepted. The article in the afternoon paper described it as being a hangout for subversives and homosexuals. The only funny story to come out of the bust is that of the only homosexuals in the place that evening, 2 school teachers who managed to escape through an extremely small window in the men's room when they realized what was going down. They knew that the city would fire any public school teacher for any breach of propriety, no matter how minor. The tragedy of the story was that all the others who were arrested that night, all straight. I'm sorry, let me read that again. The tragedy of the story was that all the others, all straight, in parentheses, who were arrested, were actually fired for allegedly being homosexual, even though they were straight. Shortly after Garrison's bringing charges against Clay Shaw and announcing that he had incontrovertible evidence to convict Shaw on charges of conspiracy to assassinate the president, along with intimations that he had an entire theory of the plot to kill the president, the town was rife with rumor. Did Garrison have anything? Those who knew Clay Shaw were bewildered. He had never expressed any unusual animosity to Kennedy or his programs. And certainly not like the uptown right-wingers who insisted that he should be impeached as an enemy of democracy and the government, or those who held that he had made deals with the Soviet Union in order to be elected. Nobody implied that he had made deals with organized crime figures to win the West Virginia primary, which he apparently did. Clay Shaw was not even the kind to tell the popular right-wing jokes of the time, 2 of which stick in my memory. They are, what did Kennedy say in his telegram to Khrushchev after this winning the presidency? Answer, we're in. Ha ha, ha ha. Also, a plane... That's really not a funny joke, but okay. Also, a plane bearing Kennedy, Johnson, Eleanor Roosevelt, Adlai Stevenson, and Hubert Humphrey crashed in the mid-Atlantic. Who was saved? Answer, the American people. Ha 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 ha. Very clever there. These 1960s jokes. Inane as they may seem now, that was representative of the right-wing humor of the time. As far as I know, Shaw never stooped to such puerile humor. If he had, I'm sure it would have come out at the trial. But there were there were stories that Garrison's prime witness, Perry Raymond Rousseau, a sometime University of New Orleans student and full-time self-promoter, had somehow run afoul of the law and had gone to Garrison with this conspiracy tale to weasel his way out. Perry Rousseau was a young, relatively attractive homosexual who always had new bizarre schemes to make himself a millionaire. My secretary of the time, who knew him slightly from University of New Orleans, but who had heard his myriad of get-rich-quick ideas from mutual friends, pronounced him an asshole, a term she didn't throw about except in the most serious of circumstances. Everyone had theories, but few of them had anything to do with Garrison having discovered the plot to kill Kennedy. What everyone was wondering was why Garrison should come up with a plot whose central figure was the relatively innocuous Clay Shaw. In terms of the fact that Clay Shaw had some degree of social entree, a very important thing in New Orleans, then, more so than now, caused a whole lot of soul-searching. People, the right people, had invited Clay Shaw into their homes and had sat on boards with him. Jim Garrison, a recently elected DA, was a social non-entity. A lot of people had supported him for office. He ran for that office as a sort of reform candidate. He had not accused his predecessor of being crooked or on the take. He just said that he was a do-nothing DA. What he said was true. The last few DAs before him were do-nothing types. The police arrested scores of people, mostly black, every day, on all kinds of charges from public drunkenness to public nuisance. The DA's office didn't accept those charges, if indeed charges were formally made, and what came to trial was more by chance than anything else. Garrison, an unknown, not even from this city or state, had no enemies, and no ugly political machine backing him, got into office relatively easily. After assuming office, Garrison kept his campaign promises. He straightened out the docket so that there was some semblance of order. He accepted charges in criminal cases of merit and pursued them. He ran a taut ship, and the black community in particular appreciated him. But he was still an unknown to this autocracy which picked candidates and saw them get elected. Clay Shaw, on the other hand, who came from a small Louisiana town on the Mississippi border, through the connections of his Senate mentor and his reputation as a highly decorated Marine captain in World War II, had by means of civic work and his establishment of the International Trade Mart gotten to the outer circle of the power structure. Had he been straight, he would probably be in the position to marry a sister or daughter of a prominent civic or social leader. He did not flaunt his homosexuality, but he didn't make any big effort to conceal it, which made some folks uncomfortable, but not enough to exclude him from the corridors of power. Some people thought this single fact, Shaw's relatively strong position in a close-knit town, despite his obviously flawed social background, would be enough to make a person like Garrison, holding a relatively important public office while being ignored by the power structure, go after Shaw to prove his worth. In short, he would institute himself into the power structure after taking out its weakest member. Since the beginning of the Clay Shaw affair, there have been rumors, which continue to this day, that Garrison has had more than a passing interest in the homosexual subculture, if you get what I'm saying. At the time, I was becoming more familiar with inner workings of the homosexual group. I met one of Clay Shaw's tenants in the Spanish stables, Shaw's first important renovation of an historic building, and one which remains as a monument to him and his influence in rejuvenating the residential French Quarter. Shaw's tenant, though not particularly a friend of his, he said Shaw was slow to make repairs unless it involved something which can be seen from the street, told me a story, the gist of which follows. After the death of the older man with whom Shaw was involved, he became intimate with a much younger, much more attractive, recent college graduate from a small town in another part of the state. Shaw saw himself in the younger man and took him on as his protege and moved him in. The younger man, who went by some typical Southern nickname like Boo or Bubba, "Come here, Boo, Bubba," was indeed bright and attractive, but he had a serious drinking problem. In the course of one of his drunken rambles, he ran afoul of the law, and in the course of proceedings found himself in contact with Garrison, whom he tried to impress by stressing his importance in the life of Clay Shaw. By this report, Garrison was smitten at first sight, but Shaw had the upper hand, and from that moment on, Garrison was looking for a method to bring down Shaw. I heard this story from several of the quarter drunks, and while I was suspicious because it sounded too facile, too easy an answer to this complex situation. Bear in mind that mine was more than a passing interest, because while Garrison was dragging out all these people in the presumed conspiracy and stating or implying that they were homosexual, I was, as far as I knew at the time, the only person who knew that Oswald was at least a part-time male prostitute. Since that time, I have found out that there were many others who knew him in that role. Like me, they were afraid to mention it to even their closest friends. On the humorous side is the story of a well-known heir to a large Texas fortune who spent the entire time of the Garrison investigation and Shaw trial on the road, checking into a new hotel or motel each night under the assumed name for fear that his connection to Oswald might come out and he would be subpoenaed. He was scared witless, even to the extent that he was traveling in his white Rolls-Royce with vanity plates and could have been found very easily through the car, which probably stood out like a sore thumb in Motel 6 parking lots. In the course of business, I met an FBI agent who I took to lunch at Galatoire's, a French Quarter restaurant, which is on most days very much like a private club. I had already realized its potential for advantageous business connections. The food is fantastic New Orleans cuisine, and the drinks were very reasonable in the 60s. In any case, after a few drinks and a couple of courses, I threw out to the FBI agent that I had heard about the reasons for the Garrison investigation. The agent looked at me like I was a complete idiot. I asked myself if I had gone too far. "Shall I say in all discretion," he said sarcastically, "that that's the main theory in the Bureau at this time. In fact, it's all they have to go on." I was nearly satisfied with the conclusions that I could draw concerning the reasons for the Garrison investigation of Clay Shaw. This does not mean that I was entirely satisfied with the conclusions of the Warren Commission. Lee Harvey Oswald didn't come across to me as the kind of person who could get together a plot to kill the president. He just didn't seem to be the kind of person who could carry off what is now known as the crime of the century. But his connection with Clay Shaw as a co-conspirator, knowing what I did of Shaw, seemed unlikely at best. Shaw, so far as I could determine, held no extraordinarily right-wing doctrinaire political position, and other than his playing local politics to promote his baby, the international trademark, would not likely be involved in a conspiracy like the Kennedy assassination. Furthermore, I doubted that Shaw would know someone like Lee Harvey Oswald. Presuming that they have met in some homosexual party even seemed unlikely. Hustlers that lived in rooming houses on Camp Street tend to be on the extreme fringe of an established homosexual community like that in the French Quarter in the 60s. They are the lowest form of homosexual life and are generally known for lying, stealing, and self-deception. Several of Mr. Garrison's best witnesses fell into this category, individuals whom he could have picked from a nearly inexhaustible array of this type in the parish prison, for whom perjury is a necessary virtue. Clay Shaw, on the other hand, was the most prominent known homosexual in the city. Were he in need of younger companions, he could have had almost anyone he wanted. He was distinguished, attractive, rich, and perceived as more powerful than he probably was. His parties and the parties that he attended were elegant and well-planned. The two just didn't seem to go together. Still determined to find out as much as I could, I invited to Galatoire's a friend from college who was at the time an assistant DA in Garrison's office. I know that he was suspicious when I first called him, since we had only seen each other a few times in the last few years. At lunch, when I brought up Garrison's name and referred to the ongoing investigation, he looked down at his turtle soup, and for a moment I thought he was going to get up and walk out. First, he assured me that he was not in any way connected with the Garrison investigation, that he was a minor cog in the machinery of the DA's office, and that if he were in on it, he couldn't discuss it with me. "But let me tell you what kind of person he is," he said, and proceeded to recount the following story. A few years earlier, in the first part of the Garrison administration, a small drugstore on St. Claude Avenue, a working-class neighborhood, had been held up. There were only 2 people in the store at the time, the druggist and a 12-year-old girl from the neighborhood. The gunman, in addition to threatening the druggist, threatened the girl, then, with the cash in the register, left and sped away in an older car, a late 50s Pontiac, if memory serves me correctly. The druggist pulled a gun out from beneath the counter, rushed out the door, and fired a shot at the fleeing car. By the time the police got there, the druggist was badly rattled, and the young girl was nearly hysterical. I don't know if this is still standard procedure for the New Orleans Police Department at this time, but in those days, a police unit would just go out to the trailer parks off Old Chef Highway, Highway 90, and round up anyone who had ever been arrested for armed robbery and put them into a lineup. A couple days later, the druggist and young girl were brought in to look at the lineups which had been assembled. The druggist and the young girl saw the lineups at different times, and on the first try, the druggist identified one of the lineup. The young girl said that she did not recognize any of them, but the ever-helpful police told her father that the druggist had made a positive identification. The next day, the girl's father called the police and told them that she thought she saw the man, but was afraid to identify him for fear of later revenge. Her father brought her back for another lineup with the same people, and she picked out the same man as the druggist. In due time, the man was tried and convicted on the testimony of the 2 witnesses. He was shipped off to Angola for a few years of hard time, and the DA crowed about the fine work all had done. About a year later, another drugstore holdup occurred, and the robber was apprehended before escaping this time. In the routine interrogation, he was given a chance to cop a plea by pleading guilty, thus freeing the overloaded criminal court's docket and further consideration if he confessed to other crimes and helped them clear up old cases. He agreed and promptly confessed to the St. Claude drugstore holdup. But they were inclined to disbelieve him, and he was interrogated several times, and he maintained his guilt. People from the DA's office came by to hear his story, and they were also suspicious that he was trying to help out an old friend or someone. Garrison was duly appraised of the situation and felt the same way, that it was a trick. It had been an exemplary trial, they had a perfect case, they had presented it well, and they had witnesses. This man was lying. It was their duty to discredit the confession. The assistant DA who was handling the mess was sent to interrogate the unfortunate confessor again. At this time, the second hold-up man was adamant and irritated. Listen, not only did I do it, but I can prove it. When I was driving away, that crazy druggist bastard came running out and shot at me. He hit the car and left a bullet hole right below the bumper, just a few inches away from the gas tank. That crazy bastard could have killed me. Turns out the guy still had the same old car, and when the police checked it, the bullet hole, old and rusty, exactly corresponding to the caliber of gun fired by the druggist, was precisely where they were told it would be. This matter was brought up to D.A. Garrison, who raved and fumed. It was a perfect case, and he was not going to back down. His assistants insisted they should contact the innocent man's court-appointed defense counsel and have him appeal on the basis of new evidence. Garrison went ballistic. They would do nothing. Such an admission would embarrass the DA's office forever. He personally would look like a fool. He was adamant. The man was lying. It was a plot to make him look foolish. A number of the new and idealistic assistant DAs were scandalized. Something had to be done. Finally, a compromise was reached. The state attorney general was approached, and it was arranged for the governor to issue a gubernatorial pardon to the innocent man. That way the DA's face was saved and justice was more or less served. The assistant DA looked up from his lunch as he finished the story. That tells you everything you need to know about Jim Garrison, he said with a smile. The trial, when it finally got started, proved to be a farce from beginning to end. It dragged on for months while all sorts of unsavory characters came forward to say that they saw a man resembling Shaw talking to a man resembling Oswald, and even Perry Russo, Garrison's prime suspect or witness, waffled when he got on the witness stand. It took the jury less than an hour to acquit Clay Shaw. In interviews with the jury, almost all agreed that their acquittal of Shaw did not imply their implicit belief in the Warren report, but none of them believed that Shaw was part of any of the supposed plot. In Jack Anderson's column of February 23, 1970, it was reported that Jim Garrison had made improper sexual advances to the son of a member of the New Orleans Athletic Club on those premises, but the affair was being hushed up. The New Orleans Times-Picayune, who generally carried Anderson's column, seemingly did not carry it that day for some reason. Imagine that. But Clay Shaw was a ruined man. He had spent $500,000 on legal fees, and all of his property was mortgaged to the hilt. He had to go back to work. His health failed, and he died at a relatively young age a short time later. Garrison went on to a judgeship in appeals court, and at this writing he is reported to be in extremely poor health. In the film JFK, he plays the part of Chief Justice Earl Warren. He looks tired, and he looks sick. Oliver Stone's film is a hodgepodge of half-truths and bare-faced lies. I sincerely regret that Clay Shaw isn't around to sue his ass off. He implies that his reason for making the film is to keep the public aware that there are too many things we don't know about the murder of JFK. In this he is right. The notion that there was a conspiracy lingers in our consciousnesses because it seems so incredible that our young heroic president was felled by a lone loony. If we accept this theory on the assassination of Kennedy involving some 15 people on the spot, then we have to accept the next logical implication, that it was a plot involving important persons and agencies of the federal government, the CIA, for example, the military-industrial complex, perhaps even the vice presidency, but in any case involving a larger number of people. But there is one flaw in this scenario, and that is best put forth in a line in the film when one of Garrison's assistants remarks that how can such a large conspiracy be kept quiet when they can't even prevent leaks from a group of 12 people, referring to their own DA's office. Stone's sleight of hand in mixing real and horrifying film with shots made for the film in grainy newsreel style confuses the issue. But that is the least of his transgressions. The American people still want answers, and Oliver Stone is giving them myth. But like the ancient Greeks who established an elaborate system of mythology to answer questions which they could not comprehend, myth is what we want to believe. It is unfortunate that there isn't a film board for honesty in film as there is in advertising, because by any standards, the film should be labeled JFK, a conspiracy myth. And there you have it, folks. From someone who was allegedly approached in Lafayette Park by Lee Harvey Oswald in early August of 1963. Now, he puts the time frame before the whole Canal Street fracas, which would have been August 9th, I believe. It's a pity we can't pin down more of a day. And basically that Oswald had a room on somewhere on Camp Street. Now, could this have been one of the mysterious rooms in the upstairs of the Hill Bolter building there? Maybe. It's hard to say. It's a very interesting proposition, though. You know, Garrison used to view this whole Kennedy assassination thing as some kind of homosexual thrill kill, which I know really eats away at a lot of people, especially when it's alleged that Garrison may have had some tendencies as well. But it seems that way with a lot of people back at that time in New Orleans. Were seemingly on the quote unquote down low. Uh, it just put these guys in pretty much the same proximity, the same circles, the same friends. And I don't think really sexuality has anything to do at all with the Kennedy assassination. I think we need to look a little deeper than that, of course. But it is interesting to note that, a lot of these central characters were indeed either openly homosexual or in the closet, kind of, sort of. And it's interesting that the allegation that Oswald was doing this for money, because apparently whoever wrote this story ended up talking to other people who claimed to have ran into Lee Oswald doing the exact same thing, being a quote unquote $5 or $10 blow and go male prostitute. It's very odd, very odd. But I'm not going to put it out of the realm of possibility. Anything's possible. I mean, it does provide somewhat of an answer as to where Lee Oswald was getting any kind of income or money. He may have been selling blowjobs in Lafayette Park, in the morning, and protesting and handing out pamphlets in the afternoon. You get a couple of guys, that's $5, $10, $20, $25, maybe $30 a day, which is probably more than he was making working at Raleigh Coffee Company. Plus he was double dipping. You could still claim unemployment, which would allow him to, of course, save enough money to make it to Mexico. So who knows? And take care of his family and this, that, and the other. So who knows? Sometimes a man's got to do what a man's got to do. So I guess some folks can turn to a life of crime and would rather, threaten you and steal your wallet and take $10 out of it, or get on their knees and whip your schlong out and give you the old slurp slurp for $10. Who knows? Interesting nonetheless. In growing up and in high school, we don't really have much information to go on as far as Oswald's sexuality. And then as he's in the Marine Corps, obviously he's doing something. He got being charged or being treated with for penile discharge, chlamydia or the clap or whatever it was that he got while he was over in the Philippines or Japan. So he was obviously sticking his dingy-lingy somewhere he shouldn't have been, whether it be in male or female, we just don't know. It's alleged that he was infatuated with a lady that worked at one of the bars there in Japan. I think it was the Queen Bee. And we know, of course, he was on the hunt in Russia, courting several ladies until he got with Marina. So, maybe it was just a matter of, him liking what he liked. He grew up in New Orleans, and this kind of subculture, subversive sexuality, of course, was somewhat tolerated in the town. And we do know that he was around it as far as being involved in the Civil Air Patrol with David Ferry, who liked to prey on young men. So who knows? Jack Ruby, it's alleged he had, gay dalliances, as well as sometimes affairs with his dancers. But, it's hard to say. We'll never know that kind of stuff for sure. Of course, without pictures, there's no proof. Just ask J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson. Anyway, that's it for today. I wanted to let everyone know that I will be doing a webinar for Dealey Plaza UK on June the 20th. If you would like to be a part of it, please head to Dealey Plaza UK website and join. Otherwise, you can probably be able to tune in afterwards. I think Bart might put it up on YouTube afterwards, but if you'd like to actually be a part of it as it's going on, you have to be a Dealey Plaza UK member. And that'll be June 20th at, I believe, 9 a.m. Eastern, my time, 3 p.m. London time. But for more details, head to Dealey Plaza UK website and check it out. Also, be listening to Quick Hits, a news and notes podcast on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, hosted by myself and Doug Campbell, host of the Dallas Action. That's right, we co-host a podcast together other than this one. It's called Quick Hits. So make sure you search for that wherever you can find this show or Doug's show or any other fine podcast out there. We just released episode 11, and our special guest Ted Rubenstein was on the show. We had a really fascinating, fun time on the show. Lots of listener emails and a good time had by all. And hopefully be looking out for me on Midnight Rider News coming up in the next couple weeks with a new show for ST. So, folks, without further ado, that's it for me. This is your boy. Peace.